Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, October 27th of 2020. I'm Kenton Bird, the co-coordinator of this series, and to my immediate right on my Zoom screen is my collaborator, Dan Bukovich, one of the founders of this series in fall of 2001. I'd also like to thank Kristen McMullen, who served as the host last Thursday for our special program about the Idaho Bach Festival in my absence. This is a weekly series of presentations by scholars from not only across the University of Idaho, but across the country. And so delighted that our guest is joining us from Lubbock, Texas, the home of Texas Tech University. I'll introduce her in just a minute, but I first wanted to tell you a little bit more about something going on this week, as well as a preview of next week's program. As those of you who heard on Thursday of this week, Thursday of last week, you heard a preview of the Idaho Bach Festival. And just to let you know that starting Wednesday evening, there will be 3 nightly programs, all at 7:30, and you can get the Zoom link by just going to UIdaho class/music/events Bach-Festival, or just search on the UI page for Idaho Bach Festival. So Leonard Garrison performing Telemann's 12 Fantasias for flute on Wednesday. He talked about that last week. Thursday, you'll hear Bach and Handel played on some unusual instruments that did not exist in their time of the composers, saxophone and marimba, as well as the oboe. And then Friday evening, back to an all Bach program with Giselle Hillier and Miranda Wilson on violin and cello, respectively. Next week, we will reach across the border to Washington State University, and Matthew Jockers, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, will give a presentation that will actually bring together mathematics and literature. And his title is How the Story Ends, or What a Machine Learned from Reading 13,032 Novels. In this talk, Dr. Jockers will describe his use of computational sentiment analysis to study 13,000 fictional narratives spanning the 200-year period from 1800 to 2000. So this should appeal both to computer scientists, mathematicians, scholars of literature, as well as those interested in a good tale. And he hints that there is a plot twist in the story, and that is the cliffhanger that you'll have to tune in next week to hear. Today, though, our presentation is actually a reprise of a virtual lecture that was given earlier this summer by Professor McCahey for the Idaho Humanities Council. And I found that presentation so informative that I thought it was worth sharing with the Renfrew Colloquium audience. And Professor McCahey taught 2 years at the University of Idaho, 2018 to 2020. And she is now, as I mentioned, at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. And so I invite her to take us back to the 1950s for an insight into the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic expedition and the topic of exploration, science, and celebrity. So welcome, Professor McCahey, and you have the command of the screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Kenton. And I was so happy to be back here virtually, I suppose, in Idaho. And as I was saying at the start of signing in, we had a ice storm or some snow in Lubbock. So it's very appropriate that today I'm going to be talking about the Antarctic and polar regions. So I'm going to go ahead then and get started. Edmund Hillary is one of the most famous figures of the 20th century. When you hear his name, most people instantly think of his 1953 ascent of Mount Everest as a member of the British Everest expedition. I'd venture that he's actually the most famous person in New Zealand history. Other than maybe Peter Jackson, many would be hard-pressed to name anyone famous in world history from New Zealand other than Edmund Hillary. But few people realize that Hillary is also really important to the history of Antarctica. So today, I'm going to tell you about Hillary's role in Antarctic history, specifically related to his involvement with the 1957-1958 Trans-Antarctic expedition. And I'm so sorry, I'm going to stop sharing because I realized I didn't hit the button that lets me share sound, which I'll need pretty soon. Okay. I've outlined my presentation as follows. First, I'm going to provide some background to the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition, which for now on I'm going to refer to as the TAE. I will then talk about the TAE itself, which is commonly thought to be and considered the last great Antarctic adventure, marking the end of heroic expeditions from the first half of the 20th century and the start of modern professional science in Antarctica for the second half of the century. Next, I'll introduce Edmund Hillary and the strengths that he was believed to bring to the project. The next two sections will address ways that both the New Zealand Antarctic science community as well as the TAE leadership perhaps came to regret Hillary's presence. And in the final two parts, I will talk about Hillary's impact and the various ways that he's remembered in relation to Antarctica. Okay, so to give you all some background, first, I wanted to start with this question, one that's integral to the background of this story, and that's who owns Antarctica? I read a lot about Antarctica, as you could probably guess, and I always seeing it kind of put out in a lot of popular sources that, well, Antarctica belongs to no one. It's a common space for humanity, sort of rhetoric like that. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Actually, 7 different countries have territorial claims in Antarctica. The 7 countries are France, Norway, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and Chile. Well, the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, which established the region as one designated for science and peace, these 7 countries didn't give up their claims, and they still hold them, but they just agreed not to enforce them while the treaty was in effect. So since today we're going to be talking about the Commonwealth, let's look at their claims specifically. First, on the far left side, you have the Falkland Islands dependency, which is claimed by the United Kingdom, a claim that's contested by Argentina and Chile. Then you have the Ross dependency in the center, claimed by New Zealand. Finally, though it's not going to feature in this story, the largest Antarctic territorial claim is the Australian Antarctic territory on the right. So if we think about these 3 areas combined, it means that by the mid-20th century, most of Antarctica was claimed by the British Empire, later the British Commonwealth. However, one thing that they were really insecure about was that despite claiming most of Antarctica, and this is an insecurity that's mostly like a UK insecurity, despite claiming most of Antarctica, Britain hadn't achieved any of the geographical firsts in the region. Their claims to discovery were fairly suspect. They weren't the first to land. They weren't the first to overwinter, not the first to the South Pole, not the first to fly to the South Pole, not the first to fly across it, and they hadn't even occupied it the longest. It was widely believed in the mid-20th century that the last great geographical first even possible was an overland crossing. This had famously been attempted in 1914 by Ernest Shackleton. His plan was to land a crossing party in the Weddell Sea area, which you can see here. And crossed to the South Pole, then finish on to the Ross Sea, on here. In the meantime, a party from New Zealand would start from the Ross Sea and lay down depots headed to the South Pole in order to aid the crossing party. Probably some of you are familiar with the story, but Shackleton's plan didn't work out. And also, as an aside, while Shackleton's story is usually told in a way that highlights how despite his ship sinking, no one died, and it was a great example of leadership and everything. But this is kind of misleading because while no one in the crossing party died, nobody on the Endurance, the ship here, died. On the other side of the continent, in the support party from New Zealand, 3 members of that party did die in the course of the Trans-Antarctic, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition that failed. So let's jump forward in time. In the early 1950s, plans were underway for the International Geophysical Year, scheduled for 1957 to 1958. This was a major international project in various fields of geophysical research. 67 countries ultimately participated, 13 of whom committed funding programs in Antarctic science. The IGY, as it was known, was a golden opportunity for Dr. Vivian Fuchs, a Cambridge-educated geologist and Antarctic veteran who worked several years for the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey. And for many years, he'd been arguing that the British should launch a transcontinental journey before the Americans or the Argentinians got to it first. He tied his expedition to the hype for the IGY and even suggested that it could contribute to the scientific data that the IGY was focusing on, plus provide studies in geology, which the IGY had chosen to ignore. But despite its public commitment to science, even for Fuchs, committing it to science was largely lip service. You can better see his and his supporters' motivation from this excerpt from his original proposal. There would be little point in pretending that the Trans-Antarctic crossing is not intended primarily to attract the attention of world opinion to our stake in Antarctica and to bestow prestige upon the people of the Commonwealth, an opportunity of doing something imaginative, adventurous, Elizabethan, popular, and perhaps ultimately remunerative in a cooperative empire adventure at little cost. His plan was very similar to Shackleton's. He had hoped to set up a base in the Weddell Sea, cross to the South Pole, and then head to the Ross Sea. He too planned on a support party from New Zealand to lay depots for him headed to the South Pole. New Zealand was initially hesitant. This would be a huge financial endeavor requiring both public and private support. And they had already needed to fund a small IGY, International Geophysical Year Party, in Antarctica. But minds changed when Edmund Hillary, a New Zealander fresh from his 1953 ascent of Everest, and at the time one of the most famous men in the world, committed to lead the support party. Who could be a more natural leader than Hillary for the last great expedition? Getting Hillary on board was a huge coup for both Fuchs and the fledgling Antarctic community in New Zealand, or so they thought. Well, the New Zealand government was funding the International Geophysical Year efforts in Antarctica. The TAE in New Zealand was forced to seek financial support from private sources. And the organization of the New Zealand Party, as well as its finances, were handed over to the Ross Sea Committee, whose largest task was raising public awareness and support. And you can see Hillary in the left corner of this picture. Initially, there was a lot of public apathy to efforts to raise support for the TAE. George Lowe, a member of the Everest climbing party who had also joined the TAE, I think said it best with these 2 anecdotes. The truth was that a vein of insular boredom with the useless wastes of the Antarctic continent ran through many a New Zealand heart, in which warmth was not really felt for anything that was not directly concerned with those basic national industries, butter, meat, and wool. And then I really enjoy this anecdote he gave from when he was fundraising in a tavern in New Zealand, where he says, Ed Hillary reckons there's a great future for New Zealand down in the Antarctic, said the mayor. How about a contribution to the funds of the expedition? At one point, one of the farming men said, the Antarctic, how many sheep to the acre does it carry? Hillary also observed a lot of initial apathy, which you can see here. The many appeals committees were doing their best against a lot of public apathy. Our main problem was that we were battling against a strong national feeling that the government should be financing the whole affair. In truth, let it be said that I thought exactly the same thing. The Ross Sea Committee tried a number of ways to get support for a TAE. This sweepstakes here is an example of one, but most of their efforts weren't successful. People were generally not interested in financially supporting an expedition like this. But it was really the fact that Hillary became the face of the expedition in New Zealand that gave it support. And let me show you a few examples. So for example, here you can see a share certificate. So if you send in £1, you could get this share an adventure. And you can see Hillary's in this advertisement. The expedition is branded the New Zealand Antarctic Expedition instead of the Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Like the Trans-Antarctic Expedition is much lower in small print and in parentheses. And the leader is marked as Edmund Hillary, as opposed to Vivian Fuchs, who of course is leading this whole expedition. Here you can actually see a share certificate, and it correctly says the Trans-Antarctic Expedition instead of focusing just on New Zealand, but there's a little picture of Hillary and you can see his signature there. Hillary also traveled throughout the country giving public talks to raise money, he was really annoyed that he had to spend a lot of time doing this instead of actually focusing on organizing it. And he found this somewhat onerous, and he says, I found the succession of talks and the support of an appeal a heavy burden, and so was all the traveling involved. In one particular day, I gave 4 public lectures and drove 500 miles in the process. I also have a short film clip so you can see what these talks kind of consisted of, and you'll see here that the title focuses again on Hillary, and it rebrands the TAE as the New Zealand Antarctic Expedition. I'm gonna go ahead and play this video.
Sir Edmund Hillary and members of the New Zealand Antarctic Expedition enter the Town Hall, Wellington, where they receive a rousing reception from 2,000 Wellington schoolchildren. Sir Edmund, who is leader of the expedition, tells the children about the difficulties which lie ahead and of the tremendous amount of work which must be done as a preliminary to next year's Antarctic venture. Mr. J.H. Miller, Lieutenant Commander Smith, Messrs. H.H. Ayres, B.M. Gunn and Dr. Hatherton, the other members of the expedition, listen with interest as Sir Edmund tells the children of his Everest adventure. What the well-dressed Antarctic traveller will wear next season. Mr. Miller dons some of the clothing each member of the team will take with him. A few adjustments and the rig-out is complete. New Zealand clothing designed and tested to resist the Antarctic cold. Just one item in the many for which funds are required by the Ross Sea Committee. Sir Edmund expressed his personal thanks for the children's efforts in raising money for the Ross Sea Appeal when he met and shook hands with representatives of Wellington schools and colleges. A proud moment for the youngsters. May we join with them in saying good luck to Sir Edmund Hillary and the New Zealand Antarctic Expedition.
Okay, so you can see this again focus is on Hillary and Hillary's sort of celebrity, and all of the children there excited to meet Hillary and everything. So public attitudes in New Zealand started shifting, and you can see this from an excerpt from the Ross Sea Committee's newsletter, saying in the last 2 months there's been a marked change in the public attitude towards the appeal, and the man in the streets is now coming solidly behind the campaign to raise funds to enable New Zealand to play its part. The expedition was also boosted when the government offered more funding to the TAE in exchange for the TAE sharing its facilities in the Ross Sea with a small IGY party. So with all of this together, they were ready to head south. With the decision that the IGY party consisting of 5 men and the TAE party consisting of 20 would be somewhat organized together, all sharing a facility under Hillary's command until the crossing began, it seemed a simple and obvious way to save resources. But I'll point out that the United Kingdom didn't do this. The British IGY party selected a site at Halley Bay, while Fuchs's TAE party was over 100 miles away at Shackleton Base. And in hindsight, this seems the wiser course of action because the priorities of the TAE and the IGY were really different. The TAE hoped to be the first to cross Antarctica, or in New Zealand's case, to support this cross-continental crossing. The IGY men, in contrast, were focusing on collecting data related to similar geophysical monitoring programs happening around the world. So these were really dissimilar goals, and it became apparent in New Zealand from the start. To select a site for what would become Scott Base, New Zealand's current Antarctic base, by the way, that's where their current base is, the New Zealand government sent a team led by Dr. Trevor Hatherton, the lead scientist for the IGY party, to select a site ideal for research, hopefully long-term research. After some reconnaissance, he selected Butter Point, which you can see here, saying it's the most convenient site. But when Hillary arrived, he really disliked the location. And here you can see the conflicting priorities of these two groups of men in his words. The situation was far from satisfactory. It seemed likely that we could build a base here that would be quite satisfactory for static scientific work, but it would be quite inadequate for my plan of widespread surface traveling with aerial support. I decided that we would have to look elsewhere for a base site. So again, he concedes that this would be a good site for research, but it's not useful for him with his plan for surface traveling. He was in overall command, and so without consulting Hatherton, he chose a different site, one that Hatherton had previously looked at but rejected. He constructed Scott Base on Ross Island at Pram Point, only a few miles from the American McMurdo station. This was a controversial move for a number of reasons. Some disliked its proximity to the United States, to the American site, thinking that the Americans would, being so near it would overshadow any work that the much smaller New Zealand group was doing. But the more serious reasons were related to how the space's location impacted how the various scientists involved in these two expeditions could do their work. Both Hillary and the Ross Sea Committee tried to argue that the move wouldn't really affect the scientific programs, which you can see these quotations here. And this is from Hillary. It was obvious that Pram Point would comply with all of the scientific requirements, excepting seismology and to some extent magnetic surveys. And then from the Ross Sea Committee, Hatherton's expert appraisal from the IGY angle was not available, but while Earth's magnetism and seismology might be somewhat affected by the volcanic origins of the rock of the peninsula, all other sciences would be unaffected. I'm going to remind you here that the IGY party for New Zealand only consisted of 5 men. And of these 5 men, one was a geomagnetician and one was a seismologist. So right off the bat, the Ross Sea Committee and Hillary admitted that 2 out of the 5 scientists' work would be hugely affected. But as much as you can see Hillary and the Ross Sea Committee kind of playing lip service to how the rest of the people won't be affected, I'm going to show you some of the reactions of the scientists to Hillary's decision and their opinions of the site's suitability. Again, the site that is still New Zealand's, where New Zealand's Antarctic Research Program is based. So this is the geomagnetician, Vern Gerard, who was for the IGY party, whose work was most affected by this move. And I have a few of his reactions here. From my point of view, it was terrible because Ross Island is a magnetic volcanic island produced by the eruption of Mount Erebus and a couple of other volcanoes. So it wasn't very good from my point of view. I promptly declared that the site could not be worse for geomagnetism. The Scott-based Magnetic Observatory must easily be the most poorly sited magnetic observatory in the world. It was one hell of a place for a geomagnetic observatory, being on the lower slopes of Mount Erebus, an active volcano, and thus the source of strong magnetic anomalies. He concedes, though, right, that the TAE gave us a lot of impetus because Hillary was very much a charismatic figure, and what Hillary did was considered important. The IGY was, to some extent, tacked on. And these are just a handful of his reactions. Gerard really felt strongly about his site. He actually left early, and he did not hesitate in subsequent interviews and writings and stuff to talk about his dislike of this particular site. The TAE party also included some scientists. After all, Fuchs had promised that the TAE was as much about science as it was about adventure, whether or not people believed it. So this is Guy Warren, one of the TAE geologists, and here was his reaction to this site. Living on Ross Island will be a terrible blow to geological work since it all boils down to the fact that geologizing on the mainland from a Ross Island base is virtually impossible without transport, which we haven't got. Ideas of getting ourselves established in the geological world with a worthwhile attack on some of the problems down here are in fact vanishing. The winter will be completely wasted and all our thin sectioning gear and microscopes and all the rest of it. Finally, if I can't get any geology done, I may as well have stayed at home. Here's another geologist, another TAE geologist, and Bernie Gunn. Gunn actually complained a lot that Hillary seemed disinterested in geology and that he also, Gunn would occasionally prepare like scientific reports for Hillary that Hillary wouldn't read. And here were his responses to the site. Hillary wasn't a bit interested in the fact I was a geologist or anything like that. To say that some of us were appalled is an understatement. Ross Island is 50 miles from the mainland and cut off from it for half of the year. Our IGY scientists were also taken aback. What meaning would seismic data have, for example, if the instruments were located on a volcano? Our geological program was immediately cut in half. No work could be done during the whole 6 months. As a scientific base, it was hopeless. But again, he concedes we had to agree with him that the site was quite good from a non-scientific point of view. Hillary circumventing the scientific programs was observed by non-scientists as well. Henry Kirkwood, the New Zealand naval commander of the HMNZS Endeavour, which logistically supported both the IGY and the TAE, wrote both publicly and privately about this issue of the competing priorities between the science and adventurism and Hillary's domination of this program. And privately he wrote, Ed Hillary is a good mountaineer, but when you have said that, you've said it all. He's not interested in science. The few IGY scientists that are at the base are good chaps, but they're not getting a fair crack of the whip at things and are too subordinated to the transcontinental journey. And then publicly, in the report that was on the previous page, he wrote, the scientific work was slowed up in the first few weeks. It was a bit frustrating for the scientists. Despite this, a considerable amount of scientific work was achieved, and although the glamour of the Trans-Antarctic journey may at times blind people to the fact that New Zealand is making a big contribution to the International Geophysical Year, it is in the field of science that the expedition will also live. As far as Hatherton, the scientific leader for the IGY, he clashed with Hillary a lot, like a lot. But rather than like listing examples like I've done for these others, I'll just give you one that I think encapsulates their conflict. Hillary had been talking about how he thought it would be a good idea for the New Zealand alpine community to be more directly involved in exploring the Ross dependency, this area of Antarctica. And in response, this is what Hatherton reported in his diary. Much talk of sending alpine club people down for summers, sterile groups, and if I had any say, it would be over my dead body. Okay, so let's jump away from Hillary's clash with the New Zealand scientists to the transcontinental crossing itself. Remember what the plan was. Fuchs and his team would start from the Weddell Sea, cross to the South Pole, where the United States had built a base for the IGY, and then continue on to the Ross Sea. The New Zealand party, led by Hillary, would be laying depots of food and fuel every 100 miles for 700 miles. It was anticipated that they would meet at this point at Depot 700 and then go back to Scott Base together. In October 1957, the Ross Sea Party began their journey, much to the relief, I would say, of the IGY scientists who were left behind. But Fuchs's Weddell Sea Party was delayed and experienced a lot of setbacks and poor weather. One more thing, there's a perception, I think, that the geography is uniform across the Antarctic continent. After all, it's just, ice, right? But Antarctica is bigger than the continental US, and the journey that they were taking is about 2,000 miles, which is about the distance between Boise and New York City. So there was geographically a lot of differences, and Hillary's terrain was just a lot easier, pretty much the whole journey. And I think that that's epitomized by this photo of one of Fuchs's vehicles having a near miss with a crevasse. By January of 1958, Hillary had finished laying the depot at mile 700, but Fuchs was way behind schedule. So Hillary wired the Ross Sea Committee and asked them what they wanted him to do. They wired back that he should go ahead and lay a depot at mile 800. Since Fuchs was having such a hard time, he might need this extra depot. But by the time their message was sent, Hillary had begun what he called a jaunt to the South Pole. Hillary arrived at the South Pole in January. He was, I guess not the third man, but like the leader of the third group of men to arrive at the pole overland and the first to arrive in an overland vehicle. These honors, these being first and being third or whatever, these should have gone to Fuchs, right? But to add insult to injury, after his arrival to the pole, Hillary wired Fuchs suggesting that maybe he abandon the crossing and try again next year since it was taking him so long and he was running so far behind. This telegram was leaked to the press, and it caused enormous embarrassment to both the British and New Zealand organizers. The press ran with the idea that these were two separate expeditions, a British expedition and a New Zealand expedition, and that Hillary beat Fuchs to the South Pole, much like Roald Amundsen had famously beat Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole 50 years earlier. Fuchs didn't take Hillary's advice, and he pressed on to the pole where he met with Hillary. Hillary and Fuchs and the Weddell Sea Party headed back to the Ross Dependency, to Scott Base, and they arrived at Scott Base in March. The overland crossing took 99 days. So I've said that the press ran with the idea that this expedition was a race and that Hillary won. You can definitely see this idea manifested in the books that came out immediately after, especially Mackenzie's in the center there, which pits Hillary and Fuchs against each other as opposites in every way. Hillary as this rugged adventuring colonial versus the stalwart establishment scientists in Fuchs. In 2018, PBS aired a scripted drama on Hillary, and they called this section The Race to the Pole. And they suggested that Hillary did it because he was bored. I would say, even though it's often characterized as a race, that it's absolutely not a race. First, I'm gonna echo the organizers who frustratedly stated all this time that this was all one expedition. This wasn't a British and a New Zealand expedition. This was this Commonwealth expedition. But second, it wasn't a race because a race suggests that there's a contest. And by the time anyone realized what Hillary was doing, he would have had to have died in order to not have been first. He was so much closer to the pole. Once Hillary decided to go, it was never going to be Fuchs. Fuchs never publicly criticized Hillary for this decision. Honestly, I don't think he could have without accusations of sour grapes. But he often complained privately about the lack of scientific results put out by the Ross Sea Party. Of the 15 reports, the 15 scientific reports published by the TAE, only 3 of them were from the New Zealand team, where the rest were from the British team. So to answer this question, what is Hillary's Antarctic legacy? Hillary stayed involved in New Zealand Antarctic affairs and helped organize one more expedition, though far smaller in scale. The truly terrible location of Scott Base and his clash with scientific leaders made him unpopular in the New Zealand Antarctic science community, compounded by the fact that his influence remained despite his lack of training or interest in science. But it's an undeniable fact that not only popular but government support for New Zealand's early participation in Antarctic science came from Hillary's endorsement. His beating Fuchs to the pole is another matter. Many, especially outside of New Zealand, especially those in the Commonwealth, felt that he had stolen the thunder of the UK for the second time. After all, when he reached Everest summit, it was for the British Everest expedition. And in this case, it was often constructed that he abandoned both the opportunity to do better with science and also potentially the safety of the crossing party when he kind of like snuck off to beat Fuchs to the pole. But he was very popular. This decision to go and beat Fuchs to the pole was very popular in New Zealand. It was constructed as a David versus Goliath triumph. The center of the world, the UK versus their tiny rural colony. Never mind Hillary's celebrity, it was a New Zealand beekeeper beating the establishment polar scientist. You may have even noticed from some of the pictures that Hillary's team used modified tractors to travel, while Fuchs used this more technologically advanced snow cruisers. So this was New Zealand farm culture beating like fancy English technology. And I would argue that this even contributed to the growing nationalism in New Zealand, where they began to think of themselves as from New Zealand rather than as British. Indeed, on the New Zealand $5 note, you can see not only Hillary and Everest, but until 2015, when they changed the way their $5 note looks, you can see the tractor that he took to the South Pole. So I hope I've explained to you some of the some new things about the history of Antarctica and about Edmund Hillary. But my major goal for today was for you going forward, when you hear Hillary's name, don't just think of Everest, think of Antarctica. So that's all I have. Do you have any questions? I don't know, Kenton, or am I gonna, oh, good.
Thank you for that informative talk, and I picked up a few more details that I didn't hear the first time around, so I appreciate that. And we're a small enough group that I think anyone who has a question could simply unmute himself or herself and ask that directly, or you could put the question into chat, and I'm glad to relay it. So James, would you like to ask something? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. I kept thinking the whole time you were talking about the role of celebrity in general and entertainment and the effect it has on science. Because in a sense, what he was doing was entertainment for the New Zealand people, right? Especially showing up for the kids. So what does this tell us about the relationship between science and entertainment and celebrity in today's climate for science?
Oh, that's like a really good question. So I think that you still kind of have this relationship between, there is still this kind of idea of scientific celebrities, even people who aren't like necessarily, you know, practicing scientists. I think like you can kind of take this in two directions, thinking about somebody like Bill Nye or something, where he becomes an authority on science as in his role as an entertainer. But then you also can think about like, you know, non-scientists altogether, like, you know, there's a number of professional actors, right, who have aligned themselves with like climate causes in order to like bring attention to these areas, or even like Bridget Bardot and the like baby seal clubbing. You see it a lot with environmental issues where celebrities kind of like cast their the cloak of their celebrity nature in order to bring attention to environmental causes. In this particular instance, where it was there was like a clash in some ways between the science and the celebrity, that the celebrity ended up overshadowing the science. I think that this is probably something that happens a lot. I'm not a scientist, and I know, and you are, so maybe you've seen it more directly, but like where, charismatic or interesting things involving, I suppose in biology, for example, where like charismatic megafauna are going to get a lot more attention than people who are doing research on like, worms or something. So yeah, I think that there still is this conflict, and I think it's a relationship that still exists. I don't know that it necessarily presents in the same way, because you rarely have now scientific expeditions where the leader is a non-scientist. I don't think anyway.
Cool, thanks. Good talk.
Thank you.
So Grace, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, yeah. I was just wondering, so Hillary sounds like, or he was obviously like very popular, had a very good demeanor, had a lot of things going for him and accomplished a lot. So I was just gonna ask you what you think his biggest like tribulation was, like either on the expedition or just in life.
I mean, like life tribulation, like in terms of tragedies that he had, or like,
yeah, like what,
or like weaknesses.
Yeah, weaknesses, or I guess like on the expedition, what, like, I don't know, how did anything not go like smoothly for him? Or
yeah, I mean, like in his life, he definitely had tragedies. I mean, his wife died in a plane crash pretty young, in the 60s, and so that's like a tribulation, I suppose. But like, he on the expedition, in terms of like what I think his biggest weakness is it's really clear when you read his writing that he has a kind of abrasive personality that people either really like or really dislike, because he basically, once he decided he was going to do something, that's what he was going to do. And like, so I think in terms of weaknesses, it's problematic if you in general are someone who, I don't know, doesn't take other people's thoughts into consideration. But at the same time, in polar leadership, in like the history of polar leadership, people like Scott or Shackleton didn't really take into consideration other people's feelings either. Like, to a certain extent, you need to have a decisive personality, I suppose, to be successful in this field. So, I mean, it's a weakness in the sense that like a lot of people don't like him now, but it's a strength because, he was like on paper successful. Like he got so much fan mail from reaching, and also I would argue that his, success in Antarctica is one of the things that made Antarctica a very important place to like New Zealand nationalism, where they really consider like the Ross Dependency as like part of New Zealand. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
So Sarah, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Daniella. Hi. Thank you so much. I'm really glad I got to see this talk because I missed it the first time around. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of analog between, or perceived analog between the Himalayas and Antarctica, because Hillary's this, high altitude mountaineer. He has experience in the New Zealand Alps and the Himalayas, obviously. But then, not just because he's a celebrity, but because there's perceived to be a connection between those kinds of environments and polar environments, he becomes the leader of this Antarctic expedition. And so I'm curious about how people at the time thought about high altitude mountains and polar regions as being similar.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely, so as Sarah said, there definitely was believed to be a lot of overlap between people who went to poles and went to high altitudes. And you saw this, I think, more in the case of New Zealand than in like the British case. Like, for example, the British crossing party did not get any kind of like training in like this kind of environment, where Hillary mandated that everyone in the New Zealand party go and spend time in the New Zealand Alps, like learning how to climb. And I have that one quotation from Bernie Gunn in there where he says something like, Hillary didn't care that I was a geologist or anything like that. If I had finished the sentence, it would have said something like, but he did care that I had trained in mountaineering under Harry Ayres because Harry Ayres had taught him everything he knew. Even though there is perceived to be a relationship between alpine and polar regions, and I think that continues to be the case. Vanessa Heggie's book, Higher and Colder, takes these two regions and puts them together as well. But it's a relationship that Hillary did not really agree with. In fact, other than the fact that he was really into the idea of the like different mountains in Antarctica that were available to climb, he thought that Antarctica was really boring compared to mountains and mountain climbing, compared to the Himalayas. Because once you get onto the polar plateau, it is just kind of like a flat desert for a lot of it. And he was used to and interested in mountain climbing. And though there is a lot of, I would say it is challenging to cross the polar plateau, which Fuchs experience more than Hillary. It's a different kind of challenge. And so he definitely, even though in New Zealand in particular, they were really interested in the idea of like, oh, well, we all need to train in the New Zealand Alps and we're all sort of outdoorsmen. Once they got there, if anything, maybe they were like disappointed that that's not what the case was. However, the New Zealand Antarctic program fostered a pretty good relationship with the New Zealand Alpine Club, because they drew on the New Zealand Alpine Club frequently to get men to fill support roles and science roles as well in their program, because they felt that like the training, at least in these sort of dangerous situations, and that at least that they would know what they were doing better than the like average person.
Other questions from our Zoom audience? So, Joanne, yes, please unmute yourself.
Hi, how are you? It's very nice to see you, Daniela.
Hi, Joanne, how are you?
Good. I really enjoyed catching up on your research. I had a question about the American response in terms of the press or scientists. Is there anything different or unique?
Yeah, so the Americans tended to definitely see Hillary's side of it, and were very like supportive of him, winning this race. And I think part of the fact that Hillary had a really good relationship with the Americans, and in fact, that's why he put the base only 3 miles from the American base at McMurdo, because he had struck up a friendship with George Dufek, who was the leader of Operation Deep Freeze, which is the Americans in Antarctica at the time. And when Hillary said he disliked the site that Hatherton had chosen, essentially Dufek suggested the new spot, flew Hillary out to look at it, and then sent a group of Seabees over to construct the hut for them. In fact, Hillary was very willing to accept help from the Americans, and the Americans frequently offered help. And a lot of the New Zealand members started kind of resenting it, because they felt like it was making them seem like they couldn't do it without American help. And to a certain extent, that's actually kind of true, because the United States military, the Navy, ended up providing so much of like the transportation and support for, because the U.S. Antarctic program still has like a spot in Christchurch, which they use to do all of the like logistical stuff for everyone headed down to Antarctica. But in terms of the race, people were definitely, I think people supported Hillary a lot. And once he got to the South Pole, he didn't wait or anything. He got on an American airplane and flew back to Scott Base to wait it out until Fuchs arrived. And then once Fuchs got to the South Pole, flew back on an American airplane back to the South Pole Station, which is where the US was. Yeah, Hillary had a good relationship with the US.
Daniella, because of the nature of this interdisciplinary colloquium series, we're always interested in methodology. Could you talk a little bit about the archives you visited, any oral history interviews you did, the use of maps and photographs to sort of recreate events from more than 50 years ago?
Yeah, this topic, most of my research deals with the UK more than New Zealand. But the New Zealand stuff is some of my favorite because I went to New Zealand on an NSF fellowship that was specifically designed for like graduate students. It doesn't exist anymore. It was for graduate students who were studying science and interpreted that loosely in either 5 Asian countries and then Australia and New Zealand. And so I was at the time hosted by the Gateway Antarctica at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. And the archives that I used for this were a mix. I used the archives from the National Library, which is in Wellington, the Alexander Turnbull Library. And I looked at like a lot of the paperwork related to this expedition and the communications that were sent back and forth between members. And then I looked at Hatherton has passed away, but his daughter still lives not in Christchurch, but near it. And she has his diary, and I went to her house and read his diary. And then the New Zealand Antarctic Society has been compiling oral history interviews for New Zealanders who were involved in this and other expeditions. And I didn't take any oral history interviews myself, although I did get to meet one of the New Zealand pilots for the TAE while I was there. But I used those oral history interviews, and so I listened to them. I've read a lot of, like, Hillary has written more than one memoir. George Lowe has written a memoir. Vern Gerard has a memoir. Guy Warren's diaries have been published. Some of these publications, like Warren and Gerard's, I'm very pleased that they're published so I can access them, but it's like, they were like self-published basically. Yeah, so in terms of methodology, I used a combination of listening to oral histories, I went to the government archives in Christchurch, the National Library, and then different people's memoirs and diaries. And a little bit for this research, although I guess it didn't come up in this talk as much, I've read the scientific papers that came out from these different expeditions. So there were various articles published in, for example, the New Zealand Journal of Geology and Geophysics, stuff published in Nature, stuff published in the Transactions of the Royal Society, stuff like that.
Well, thank you for distilling those myriad of sources into this short presentation for us today.
It was super fun. And because, like, actually, I use more sources for my New Zealand stuff than I do my British stuff, even though my British stuff is the bulk of my work. I only use like 3 archives there, but in New Zealand, there are a lot that I could use.
So Dean Quinlan, do you have a question for our guest?
Yeah, sure. Good to see you again, Daniela. I hope all's well in Texas. Always appreciate your
It's a snow day today, so.
Good. I was kind of wondering about kind of gendered perceptions and self projections and the role of masculinity in science and how this kind of plays out. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts on that, and kind of in tandem with that is also national competitiveness with science and how that is also kind of caught up in notions of masculinity and projection and display. But anyway, I was curious if your work had touched upon that at all, and what you thought about that.
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 points there. The question about science and nationalism and science and gender. It's funny that you ask about gender because Sarah Pickman and I were on a panel earlier today on women in polar research for the Smithsonian. Like that's a question that for me comes up a lot. I think that the issue with this kind of construction of a polar explorer, both Fuchs and Hillary for that matter, they're kind of perceived as not only masculine, but like the most masculine of men. They have to have this sort of level of toughness in order to do science. And this was a real interesting issue in the Antarctic because women weren't allowed to participate in Antarctic research for kind of a long time. The United States started allowing in 1969. New Zealand, I think, was 70. And then Britain wasn't until the 80s. And Britain didn't give women equal access, though, until 1996. And it's interesting because most Antarctic research after the TAE, I mentioned like how the IGY guys are mostly just sitting at the base. That's what most Antarctic research is. It's just you're on the research base. You're not like going out on these heroic ventures in unknown territories and stuff. But because Antarctic research was constructed as being this place for explorers and adventurers, it meant that even though, you know, most Antarctic science is like really safe, it's like just in an office that you live in, it still kept women from being able to participate because it was constructed in this way. I mean, leaving aside whether or not women can do these kind of heroic exploring kind of things, if we put all of that aside, just that's mostly not what Antarctic science is, but because it was constructed in that way, it meant that women were not allowed to participate for a really long time. As far as nationalism goes, I actually find this question really interesting because these men, like in theory, this is the British Commonwealth. They should be like unified or whatever, right? But in fact, they, like you can see at this point in time, the Suez Crisis is 1956. The British Empire is kind of crumbling. And so there's number one, an insecurity among like British scientists that London's no longer like the center of the world. But also there's a thought that, you know, if they can't be supreme in like science, if they can't kind of hold supremacy in like global imperialism, they're at least going to try and hold supremacy in the Antarctic. I think that this comes out really well in, I have an article that I'm revising right now for ISIS that I've told you about, but it involves geological specimens, and it's a set of specimens that were gathered during the TAE. And New Zealand, and at the end of the expedition, New Zealand and London started fighting over them, the New Zealand Geological Survey and the British Natural History Museum, because both argued, like New Zealand argued that, well, they were largely gathered in the Ross Dependency in the Southern Hemisphere. We have this sort of connection to them. The people who were the geologists, in fact, on these expeditions were 2 New Zealanders and then 1 Australian. They weren't gathered by British people. They should stay here. Whereas the British were like, well, if they go to New Zealand, they'll be sterilized because everybody goes to London and nobody goes to Christchurch. So yeah, there was a real sense that British scientists were kind of dealing with this insecurity of all of a sudden having to actually compete with scientists from their former colonies. Like thinking about Hillary on the money, I've joked before that every famous person from New Zealand is on their money. Because like Hillary's on their $5 bill, but on their $100 bill, it's Ernst Rutherford who split the atom, right? But Ernst Rutherford left New Zealand when he was 18, and I'm pretty sure never went back. He never lived there again. But, you know, like, because previously, before the 50s or so, if you were a really smart person in a colony, if you wanted to make your way in the world, you went to the UK and did all your work there. But now we're seeing a moment where all of a sudden these colonial places are thinking they can compete with London, and it's very like disconcerting for British scientists.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I wanted to be sure everyone saw that Sarah put into the chat a link to the Women's History from the Smithsonian, the American Women in Science program. So thank you for that. We've come to the end of our hour, and I'd like to invite the audience to turn your camera on so that our guest can see who she's been speaking to. And if you'd like to offer a virtual round of applause or give a thumbs up through your Zoom icon. It's been terrific to have this conversation. Thank you all for the informed questions and comments. And I hope you'll join us next week for an Election Day program that has nothing to do with the election, and that's Matt Jockers, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Washington State University, Sean's counterpart from 8 miles away. And he'll be speaking about how the story ends, or what a machine learned from reading 13,032 novels. So hope you can come back. And Daniella, you're welcome to join us any Tuesday at 12:30 Pacific time that you'd like to catch up with your colleagues here at Idaho. So again, thank you very much. Thanks for your attendance and participation. We'll see you next week.
Bye. Bye, Sean.